think we'll just give it a minute while everyone's joining us. Welcome. Welcome all attendees. We'll begin in just a minute. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our conversation with Peter Kovler about his history with the FDR Memorial, titled The FDR Memorial at 25, Building Meaning and Understanding. Today's event is hosted by the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee. My name is Janine Connolly. I'm a white female with long hair with silver highlights, and I'm wearing a floral blouse and a black jacket. My pronouns are her, hers, and she. I help with marketing and communications for the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping tips. Our ASL presenter today is Cheryl. Welcome, Cheryl. We are presenting in gallery view, so the interpreters should always be visible. You do not need to pin them. This is important. If you were to pin the current interpreter, oh, actually, we only have two. So you don't need to pin in. It will be fine. Captions are available on Zoom. You can click Show Subtitle in your Zoom menu bar to turn them on. You do not need to be on Zoom to access the call. We will read all questions out loud so that the content will be available to individuals calling in on the phone or who cannot see the visual content. This call is being recorded and it will be posted to our website for future use. We will have a Q&A towards the end of the discussion. We invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A tab on the screen located at the bottom of your menu bar. You can also email them to me at Janine@KDR Communications. I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat box so you can have it. But if you're on the phone, it is spelled JEANIE@KDRcommunications.com. We'll be happy to add those questions. I did want to let you know this is our kickoff event. Some of you may have heard our 25th anniversary for the FDR Memorial is coming up next week. So we're kind of a preview kickoff event. And I'd like to share some of those events with you and invite you to join us. Links for all these events will be in the chat along with more information. So on Tuesday, May 10th, beginning at 4:30, there will be a panel discussion on the FDR Memorial called A Reflection on the Past and a Plan for the Future. This panel will be hosted by Jonathan Capehart of the Washington Post and MSNBC. More information will be in the chat. On Wednesday, we will hold our anniversary celebration at the FDR Memorial. Begins at 11 o'clock on Wednesday, May 11th, and information will be in the chat. No RSVP is needed to attend the anniversary event on Wednesday. Now that we've covered those important points, we can get started with our program. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Mary Dolan, co-founder and executive director of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, who will introduce Mr. Peter Kovler.
I want to take a moment to ask if anyone because we're having some access issues. So I want to just take a moment to see if we need to resolve that.
All good here.
Okay, is everyone able to, if you could put into the chat, if everyone is able to see the interpreter, please? Okay, all right. Okay, well, we have a great team on board trying to make sure we are providing the fullest access. So someone says no, I've sent you a message. So, okay. So it sounds, looks like the team is working on it behind the scenes. So I don't want to, I'm worried about starting until we have everyone able to access what we're doing. So if you can, if you're having difficulty, can you quickly please advise if you're still having difficulty? So right now, they're only seeing me. Maybe, do we need to spotlight Cheryl?
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay, how about now? If someone could advise, I can see Cheryl, yes, only her though. Okay, all right. If that's okay, if there's any further questions, if the team can please communicate with our wonderful participants by chat. Thank you all for your patience as we work out that really important issue. And it's testimony to the fact that, you know, accessibility does take always a little bit more effort, but we're going to always do it. And I hope you all do it too. And I think this is actually kind of a good lead in to our conversation. But before that, we do that, I am Mary Dolan, and I am a co-founder and executive director of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee. I'm co-founder with two other wonderful individuals, Jim Dixon and Jane DeLand. And happy anniversary to the FDR Memorial. It turned 25 years old on May 2nd, so just 2 days ago. And one of the things that just absolutely had to happen when this anniversary was coming was find some time to sit down with Peter Kovler. Peter Kovler is many things. He's a native Chicagoan. He's now a Washingtonian. He is the chair of the board of the Judy and Peter Blum Kovler Foundation. He also is a champion of FDR and his legacy. And dare I say, and I think maybe he might agree too, that were it not for him and his efforts, the FDR Memorial likely would not be in existence today. I also want to just say personally, Peter is an absolutely lovely individual, it never refuses a phone call from me for advice. And I've enjoyed knowing him for many years. And Peter, welcome. It's really a pleasure and a personal honor to have you with us today.
Mary, thank you. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for emphasizing the better sides of my ways. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
You're too funny. Well, I could go on.
Here to help and to educate and to be a bit of a link to another era and to my perspective of how all this came about. So delighted to be here. By the way, I want to take a hint or two from Janine. My pronouns are he and him. She mentioned her hair. Amazingly, I'm about to turn 70 and I actually have a little hair left. So there's maybe that's helpful.
That is well, and thank you, and for myself, yes, thank you. I don't know if I can get away with saying that I'm blonde anymore, so I'm graying blonde, shoulder length hair, white woman with a blue sweater.
Oh yes, also I'm Caucasian.
Yeah.
Man, him. Okay, he, him. All right. I think I've tried to do my part.
Yeah, I think we got it. So, but good. Thank you. Yeah, we're always striving for full access, full inclusion. That's what we're about. And yeah, so with that, Peter, when I first heard of you, I was a younger individual, and I had heard that there was this guy who single-handedly saved the centennial of FDR. So can you tell us about that story, about you as a young buck, and what motivated you to just turn all your attention to FDR's 100th birthday?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to look back. It's a bit of a, it takes a little imagination because it happened a very long time ago. It was 40 years ago. I was closer in age to where my grandchildren are now, to where I am now. But very quickly, by complete chance, I was working in the Commerce Department of the government of a president from long ago, Jimmy Carter. And someone said to me, "Did you happen to know it's Franklin Roosevelt's 100th birthday?" This gentleman, Horace Knowles, happened to have the exact same birthday, January 30th, as Franklin Roosevelt. So it might be the kind of thing a person like that would keep track of. And it just it was provocative. It was kind of interesting to me. So I asked a few people. I was friendly with some of what in that generation would have been called the old timers because of the work I had done. And I said, "Did you know anything about this? Do you know anything about that?" And no one knew anything about this. The people who should have known didn't know. And was a wonderful scholar of that era named Frank Friedel, a Harvard University professor of Franklin Roosevelt, said, "Have you ever gone to the Library of Congress to look and see what they do for centennials of presidents?" And I went. In those days, any citizen could walk into the Library of Congress. And I went, holy smokes. I saw this enormous volume after volume of what the United States government did for the centennials of its presidents: Washington, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, etc. And I said, oh my gosh, the country's made a big mistake. So I started to organize the centennial, got the surviving members of the Roosevelt administration. They had to have been quite young when they served FDR, because by the early 80s, they were in their 70s and 80s. We put together a committee. Hard to imagine, in that era, there was no internet, of course. And we just put all our names down on a piece of paper and we called ourselves a committee. There was no one gave us approval, but the names were large for that era, very significant individuals. And we called ourselves a committee. We started going to institutions to get them to do things. And we were very influential. The Smithsonian did the second largest observance in its history at that time. The only previous larger one had been in 1976 for the bicentennial of the country. Many, many, many things happened. In my judgment, it led to it was catalytic for the memorial, because at that point, interest in the memorial had died. Congress wasn't going anywhere with it. Nor was anybody else. Years later, I learned that something very similar to this happened with the centennial of Abraham Lincoln in 1909, which eventually was catalytic and eventually led to the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in 1922. So some things are just trigger other things. And in this case, the centennial, which I learned later can be called centennial, caused a renewed interest in how to remember or how to memorialize Franklin Roosevelt, and off we went.
Well, what was it about FDR that, I mean, not a lot of 28-year-olders, no matter how mature they are, would stop what they're doing and say, I gotta do this, or I can't sleep at night? Well,
I think for me and for so many others, FDR symbolized many enduring ideas that mattered in the 1980s, they mattered in the 1940s, they matter today. FDR stood for the American government addressing the needs of those in most trouble. And of course, that is connected to his taking on the Great Depression, the worst American domestic situation since the Civil War, taking it on successfully and bringing America back into a robust economic circumstance. FDR stood for freedom, stood for taking on, what would I call it, nefarious or sinister forces from overseas, perhaps in some ways like we have with Mr. Putin today. And he took on Hitler and the Empire of Japan and other allies, Mussolini. So I thought this is something that should be remembered and shouldn't be overlooked. And FDR, of course, as we now focus on more, stood for what a human being can do if he or she is disabled. Here was a man in a wheelchair who beat Adolf Hitler, who beat the most sinister force known to the world at that time. So there was a kind of parable side to the FDR story of this disabled man who could accomplish more probably than any other American, with the possible exceptions of Lincoln and Washington. I hope that explains some of my reasoning, and for some reason it had been overlooked, and I knew that centennials were big celebrations in cultural fields as well as in political fields, so why not give it a try?
Sure, sure. Well, yeah, well, that makes sense. But, you know, did you, were you raised with in an FDR loving household? And
Yes,
that sense of,
not exclusively. It's not as if there was memorabilia all around or old posters or that sort of thing. But FDR and Eleanor, were, the first lady of the world, were icons in my family. Not the only icons, but they were icons probably in every family I knew. I think it was generational. I think that people who came from the background of my parents and all of their friends, it was just a normal thing. You didn't even think about it. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt was the greatest hero. And Eleanor Roosevelt was first lady of the world. That was just the way it was. So that's my best explanation.
sure, sure. Well, you know, you mentioned in a news article about your youth and loss happening in your youth, which led you to have an awareness of pancreatic cancer, and as well as what a foundation can do.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could just share with us a little bit about that sense of service. It sounds like that you were instilled with at a very young age, and how that informed this decision of you to direct your youthful energies and vigor for the
Thanks for
centennial.
asking. Well, my life is, I don't want to go into too much depth about my own experiences, but since you've asked, I did as a teenager lose a parent, a mother, from pancreatic cancer. Later on in life, that led me to want to, as President Biden says, turn grief into purpose, and it made me want to take on helping for research for this disease. And we've made a lot of progress in pancreatic, and eventually chaired the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network. But thank you for giving this some attention. It's not part of the life of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, but it is a form of tragedy that happens, I think, to about 52,000 Americans per year now.
Wow.
And will soon be the second or third leading cause of cancer death in the country.
Well, that's, I mean, you are the leading funder of the FDR Memorial, but you're also a leading funder for so many other things. And I think you deserve credit for that, for all of the many important causes that you have helped make significant progress on. So
it's been a strange life and a strange career, and stumbling from one thing into the next, but if we can make a difference, that's great.
Well, let's get to some of this. I know you said strange, but you know, interesting, you know. So you ran the centennial.
Yes.
And you thought that that's supposed to kickstart building a memorial, it sounded like.
Well, in real time, I didn't understand it. I just thought the
Mhm.
centennial was a good idea. And
Mhm.
I'd seen the precedents of all the other large presidents having centennials. I remember we laughed because Herbert Hoover and millions of dollars appropriated from the Congress. And of course, Herbert Hoover is generally regarded as one of our worst presidents. So I thought, how can we celebrate Herbert Hoover and ignore Franklin Roosevelt for a centennial? And we got lucky. The timing was right. There was it became interesting to journalists because it had conflict in it. Celebrating Franklin Roosevelt at the moment of Ronald Reagan's presidency made it interesting to reporters. Reagan had a more anti-government view, Roosevelt pro-government. Reagan had a view of more confrontation with enemies, with Russia in particular. Roosevelt had a more nuanced view and of course, they both had to deal with different issues at that time. So it became, Reagan gave the impression of indifference to people who were having a hard time. Maybe that's unfair 40 years later, but that's the way he came across at that time. And Roosevelt, of course, was a traitor to his class, the opposite of the Reagan. So that became part of why I think why it interested a lot of people. But Roosevelt versus Reagan became a kind of a shorthand way to look at your world in the 1980s.
All right. So all right. So then when did it really start becoming maybe possible that there could be a memorial
Great question.
happening?
Shortly after, suddenly the idea of hearings became more pragmatic. For a legislator, it elevated, maybe that's the right word, it elevated the subject because it had been on a back burner. No one thought much about it. One day it's going to happen, but not now. And suddenly there was a realization that if FDR was 100, there was a realization for the men and women of an older generation, maybe we're not going to be here forever. Maybe we ought to get this done before the possibility of it getting done doesn't happen. I remember a famous civil rights lawyer named Joseph Rao, who testified in front of a Congressional Appropriations Committee. He used a few more colloquialisms. And he said, Mr. Chairman, we got to get this done before we all croak. So there was sometimes what would I call it? There were sometimes those kinds of ways of trying to give some urgency to it. There were many people who started pushing for this, and they ranged from, these are names from another era, a man named Claude Pepper, who was a congressman in the FDR era, senator from the FDR era, who knew Roosevelt, spoke eloquently at a joint meeting of Congress we had, who went to President Reagan directly, and they I wasn't at the meeting, kind of said, look, we're old timers. We may not agree on everything, but it's time for us to get this done. There were many such meetings between legislators and the executive branch, and things just started to roll. Sometimes it became an agenda item for people instead of something where people would say, this doesn't matter.
Well, I know that I've read about the designs and the design competitions in the
Sure.
60s
Sure.
and that the memorial had gone through fits and starts in terms of it. But so it sounds like at one point a couple of folks got together and said, gosh darn it, let's do it. And it sounds like you were also in those conversations. So
I was in those conversations, as well as frankly, some of the ones that were not public. How do we get this more widely known? A wonderful senator, the late Carl Levin, who should get credit for Fala in the memorial, his idea. I remember a meeting with him saying, how do we get this moved to a higher priority in a certain committee? Wonderful congressman, my former boss, Sidney Yates, his chief of staff, Mary Bain, who'd been the head of the National Youth Administration in Illinois for FDR. People in different committees in Congress, which was one angle I saw, but it became a public issue too, a kind of a general feeling of let's get this done. Important journalists from that era, like Hugh Sidey of Time magazine, these names are gone, and even the publications are somewhat gone. But at that moment, they had influence, and people suddenly said, well, maybe I can participate in this. And then as I tried to talk about, people suddenly realized this generation was moving on.
Yeah.
And we had better get this done. The only memorial, as people may know, that had been set up was one that Roosevelt probably said, I don't need a memorial. Just send me something the size of my desk. And you can still see that sort of micro memorial in front of the National Archives. Now, what a strange sense, what a strange kind of self-awareness that someone who was clearly going to be known as one of the great presidents of the United States would say something, it almost sounds tongue-in-cheek, set up something the size of my desk, and it was done. He apparently said it to Justice Frankfurter. So that was what we had as a memorial for Franklin Roosevelt for 50, I tried to write that, for 52 or 55 years, depending on how you count it. Just that little block, which anyone can see if they drive down Pennsylvania Avenue, until the momentum started to create this, the appropriations from Congress, Larry Halprin, the beautiful design, the marvelous sculptors. It took some time to get it going, but then it did. Then it did happen.
Yeah.
I
So
want to make one other point about this that may be helpful to the audience. When you're building a memorial to such a large figure, everybody has a stake in it. There's an endless back and forth and debate. So the way I often describe it when I take people out to the memorial is that it took 50, I use the date of death as the starting point for building the memorial to the really important American figures. So if you look at the Lincoln, assassinated in 1865, memorial dedicated in 1922, that's 57 years. That's 3 generations. Roosevelt isn't far behind. It took about 52 years from 1945 to 90. I won't be doing my math exactly right, but about that. Almost 2.5, 3 generations. For George Washington, it took almost 89 years because of the Civil War and Protestant Catholic conflict and other kinds of things. So when you're really honoring someone of such stature, it takes a lot of time for people to sort out why they're honoring this person, who they're honoring. Sometimes I have found that the rapid turnaround on memorialization, physical memorials, is an indication of haste. Something that goes through a lot of deliberations, at least in these 3 cases, maybe Jefferson too, reflects it, and we have something that are landmarks for this country, and I believe will last as long as the country lasts.
Well, so it's amazing it's there. And you've said to me in some of our chats that you still think it's a miracle that it happened.
It is a miracle. Lots of things had to come together. There were government shutdowns during the construction, and that delayed the moment of dedication. There were conflicts about what do you include. There were some very original things in the FDR Memorial, not just the sculpture of FDR, the disabled sculpture, but you were including a former First Lady. It was very innovative. There was no Martha Washington and there's no Mary Todd Lincoln in those memorials. You're very innovative to include Eleanor in the memorial, and then to include her with her United Nations affiliation. There was using sculpture, using a park-like setting rather than one large iconic figure as you have with Lincoln. And as you may know, if you go back to the Lincoln Memorial from time to time, they describe the outer part of the memorial as a temple, or something very more Greek in history or in origin, or the obelisk type object of the Washington Monument. Those are very European. This is almost a park, has a park-like aspect to it of walking through and enjoying. All of these things were very provocative because when you're trying something new like this, using water like this. Anyway, all those things ended up in fights of one kind or another.
Well, one of someone who also figures in a legendary status for the memorial, of course, is Lawrence Halprin, Larry Halprin, the famed landscape architect and the designer of the FDR Memorial. And I think a lot of these decisions came not maybe from him, but generated from his
Sure.
artistry. And so can you talk to us about your relationship with Larry? Because
Oh, I had a lot.
you've become friendly with
It's
him.
gonna sound strange, but Larry and I had a lot of fun together, and and he could say things very with irony or satire a little bit. Two things strike me all these years later. One was going around the memorial as it was being put together with Larry. The intent, how he noticed details was unspeakable. He would see the water coming through the rocks and say it's going through the wrong part of the rock. Things that any casual observer or even a serious observer wouldn't catch. Larry also liked to make the point about how the memorial unveiled itself. I thought that was a wonderful word choice. That when you saw it at the beginning, you didn't quite understand what was coming. It's unlike when you walk up the stairs of the Lincoln Memorial, you see pretty close to exactly what you're going to see. Or if you walk around the Washington Monument or Jefferson, but FDR slowly reveals itself. And that's a kind of interesting experience for the person going to the memorial. It's not, it's a very pleasant experience to suddenly be surprised by something wonderful that you didn't know was there. That was one aspect of being with Larry. I should tell you also, he gave me one of the most generous gifts I've ever received, though not generous in financial value. He liked to make fun of me and my enthusiasm, and I occasionally could give him a poke or two. But at the night of the evening of the dedication of the memorial, Larry gave me a gift which I still have, and actually in my office. He gave me a sleeping bag. He said, "Peter, you're out here so much, and you'll be staying out here at night too, I'm sure. So here's a sleeping bag for you." What a gift from the architect. He was a charming man, and in addition to his great gifts and his perseverance, and adaptability. At some point, we'll talk about the disability sculpture, but Larry thought he'd finished something he'd worked, the masterpiece of his life. And he thought he finished it, and oh my God, that was not the last chapter. Thanks to the work of Mike DeLand and Alan Reich and everybody in the disability community, Jim Dixon, you. Suddenly there was a new chapter coming in this memorial, and Larry adapted with Robert Graham to give us the prologue. Wonderful experience, lovely man.
Well, maybe this is a good pivot then to but I don't want to pivot too soon, because there was that lead up to 1997, May 2nd, 1997, and the memorial was going to be opened. Tell us about those days leading up to it. Were you still thinking it's not going to happen?
Yes, and everyone was so busy with moment-to-moment things to do that we kind of didn't look at the big picture. But I do remember the day. It was a nice day, and President Clinton gave a beautiful speech. President Clinton's quite an enthusiast for the memory of Franklin Roosevelt. And what can I say? It was a very large audience. I remember I was given the good fortune of sitting right behind the president. And and you look out and you see suddenly, I don't know, a couple thousand people. I can't remember, something like that. There were headlines in the days of print newspapers, everywhere. Lots of old timers, lots of people who had lived during the era of Roosevelt, and of course, this is at the end of their lifespan, and that was very moving to me. People just cared. Older people, I remember, brought grandchildren, and kind of there was some what would I call it, teary moments, weeping. They wanted to explain to their children and grandchildren what that era was like, what it was like to lose everything in the Depression, and that was very poignant. Or they would describe what World War II was like, and a lot of that. I'll try to put this in context.
Mhm.
With about 56 million people dying in World War II, it's hard to imagine a calamity of such size for following generations. So it was interesting to see people try to explain it. One other possible useful anecdote is after 9/11, I would take people out and I tried to do a little arithmetic in my head, and I'd say 9/11 has been so horrible for you all in this generation. But imagine having 9/11 every day for 57 years. That's the amount of lethality of World War II. So
Mhm.
there's a kind of, it became kind of an exercise in how to educate new generations in the wars that Franklin Roosevelt won. And maybe that's helpful.
Mm. No, that is very helpful. And on a personal note, I remember telling my parents about the work that we were doing when I was at the National Organization on Disability about the FDR Memorial. And suddenly my father started talking about Roosevelt and and um, and my mom, you know, as wives sometimes do, or partners sometimes do, said, I've never heard you talk about FDR like that before. I didn't know you liked him that much. But there was something about that memorial being built
Yes.
that unleashed this feeling that he started to share about being a teenager in the US Navy during
Yes.
World War II and having lived through the Depression. And that got unlocked when
Yes.
I said this is happening in Washington, and stimulated a conversation that I don't think would have had before. And I would imagine that was replicated in a lot of houses across America.
I think so. And you used a good word, unleashed, because sometimes things from long ago are suppressed or they're just not interesting. And then sometimes, for whatever combination of reasons, they're unleashed. And I think the creation of the memorial caused many people to want to look back. And suddenly, with the gift of time, things become a little more important than they seemed contemporaneously. Maybe as a young, you're working, people are building careers, people are building families, and maybe only in their 70s and 80s do they look back at their teens or 20s and say, boy, that was really something. And in the case of that generation, Roosevelt symbolized uh, winning the greatest war in the history of the human race. That's not a bad legacy. And people sometimes forget you could have lost World War II. In fact, the first 2 years of the war, things were not looking so good. So taking for granted that the commander in chief would lead the country to victory would be a mistake. Should not have been taken for granted that we could come back from 32%, probably 32% unemployment. We don't really have a number because we didn't even collect data when Roosevelt became president. We didn't know how many people were unemployed. So unleashing, to use your word, those memories, I think became very important for people who probably born around 1920, like my father was, maybe in the teens, who had a last chance to get their view of their youth known to children, grandchildren, or known in one way or another. It's an interesting experience. We see it now sort of in the Holocaust Museum. I know where your husband works. Efforts to make it known these things were real. They really did happen. There really was a war. There really were people, young men in that generation who really fought. These things really did happen, and there was the memorial, the physical memorial, was a way to get that kind of story done. There really was a time when nobody had work, nobody had income, families were destroyed, people had to hop trains, and all that is kind of conveyed in a memorial. I hope I've explained that in a way that's understandable to the audience.
Oh, most definitely, most definitely. So, so the memorial gets dedicated, and it was I remember it was a beautiful day.
Yeah.
But there was, you mentioned conflicts in building memorials. So there was some folks who I knew, the organization I worked for, led by
Sure.
Alan Reich and Mike DeLand and Jim Dixon, who was our grassroots organizer. I was a young person and I just came on board in 1995 to the organization. And I was told that we were going to take on this fight, this campaign. And I said, okay, because I just got a job and I was happy to get a paycheck. But explain how about that time when
Well, I think
it got
those of us who
dedicated
worked on
and
the memorial were just exhausted, frankly. I
Mhm.
don't think we were hostile to anything. We're just tired. People had worked for quite a long time to get this thing done. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, you haven't done it. And it doesn't take a great imagination. Any of us who've ever done anything over a short or long period of time think when we're done, but no, we're not. And then that became something that one had to weigh. Within the disability community, as I remember it, though it's not, I can't, don't consider myself authoritative. The previous generation of disabled people who were quite responsible for this memorial, people like Senator Dan Inouye, they did not regard disability as something to be visually presented. I hope I've said that right. And so they said, no, we're not going to do this. And we already have a sculpture of Franklin Roosevelt. But there was a new way of thinking coming along. Today, they would call it disruptive, a new way of thinking about disability. And that Mike and Alan represented were, and there was a lot of push. And finally, there came a moment of an agreement between Larry Halprin and who thought, I can see a way to do this. And they invented the name Prologue. Who the hell ever heard of a name Prologue on a presidential memorial? All of these things had to be created anew. None of them are in Lincoln. You don't have the precedent in Lincoln or in Washington or in Jefferson. So you had to really put give it all your imagination you can. And they figured out a way to do the sculpture, to do an additional room, as in the vocabulary of Larry, in the front. And boy, has it worked out. And to someone who comes in today, you would never know that there was this kind of conflict. It seems like the Prologue has always been there, but it had to be created anew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after that 1997 initial dedication, and you heard that around that time of that dedication, there would be a new depiction, and you said everybody was tired. How did you feel about it personally? Were you surprised that this beautiful thing that you just had dedicated was gonna have something new to it? Were you worried? How did you personally feel?
Thank you for the question. As anyone in my family could tell you, I don't do well with new ideas. And if it's something new coming along, I say, oh, this can't possibly happen. But eventually, the new idea began to make more and more sense. And you could see kind of a movement in that direction. In my own circumstance, I was then and am now the director of a philanthropic foundation. And the sculpture and the Prologue needed not only federal money, but needed private money. And I was able to have this foundation play its part in the funding of the sculpture. I remember for myself having the wonderful experience of visiting with the sculptor Robert Graham out in his studio near Los Angeles. And we were able to, he showed it to me in process. And I thought, what a wonderful, how lucky can a guy be to be able to see one of the great sculptors of our time in the process of making something. And when we had just a very nice afternoon. So it came along, it happened. Eventually we had the dedication with President Clinton. And of course he was, as always, his eloquent self. Then we had an additional dedication of just a few years later with President George Bush 41, who had been so important in getting this part of the memorial added. And he was funny. Funny with self-awareness, I should say. because I remember him saying at the ceremony, he said, boy, in my family, this is paraphrasing, of course, in my family, Franklin Roosevelt wasn't very popular. And so he was kind of humbled by it, but excited by it as well. And I remember him going to the important Republican congressman of the Appropriations Committee at that time, a man named Ralph Regula of Ohio, and making the case. And a large part of the credit for the dedication stone and parts of that part would have to go to George Herbert Walker Bush. I would say there were three presidents important. President Reagan, who had an interesting circumstance because as a young man, Franklin Roosevelt was his hero. What a strange twist of fate that Ronald Reagan would go from being a Democrat to a Republican. And I remember trying to work with the Reagan White House, and what an odd dynamic that was, because to Ronald Reagan himself, Franklin Roosevelt was a hero. But to the Republicans around Ronald Reagan, he was still a villain. Franklin Roosevelt was still a villain. So you had this odd dynamic of the political party and the staff. Now, the last thing in the world they'd want to do is honor Franklin Roosevelt. But Reagan himself, I believe, cherished what his youth, the way he had seen the world as a kid. His father was on the dole, so to speak. And so it was an odd dynamic. And then President Clinton had so much to do with getting the memorial to the finish line. And then President Bush with, in my opinion, with adding the sculpture of FDR in the wheelchair. Presidents mattered.
Well, and you just talked about a time that folks coming up now have only heard about, that time when there was bipartisanship on issues, that certain things did cross party lines.
Yes.
And this memorial, I would imagine, maybe you might say that it wouldn't have happened were it not for that people crossing the aisles and seeing
People
the benefit.
crossing aisles and times changing and careers changing. I don't think young Ronald Reagan ever imagined he'd be a Republican president, and they changed parties and become a Republican president. Bush 41 had the kind of self-awareness about how within his family, Franklin Roosevelt was a very unfavorable figure. In contrast, Bill Clinton would probably say that Franklin Roosevelt was a major figure for him and his family, as he was such a great figure in Arkansas and elsewhere in the South. So it's just a funny set of circumstances, and they all came together. And we have this memorial. I have never done a study of the Lincoln Memorial, but I've seen pictures of the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial, where Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers were able to. And it sometimes happens that old conflicts lose their intensity, and people can come together to memorialize something that turns out to be so enduring. What interests me, Mary, and perhaps interesting to people in this audience, is the future of the FDR Memorial. When people created the Lincoln Memorial, they didn't imagine it would become something connected to civil rights. 1922, who's thinking about March on Washington and a man named King and all of that? And now 100 years later, you have some very different connections, associations with Lincoln Memorial, and it interests me. You and I may not, I certainly won't be here, but we won't all be here decades from now. But at some point, the Roosevelt Memorial will be used for different things. And it'll be, maybe presidents will go there more often. Bill Clinton signed bills at the FDR Memorial. No president has done that since then. They should. We don't quite know, but it's there and there for the use of the country.
Well, definitely. And we're going to, Janine gave a rundown of the events that we're going to be having next week for the 25th anniversary. And one will actually be at the FDR Memorial on Wednesday, the 11th of May at 11 a.m. And there's some information on our website, and Janine and my good friends on who are helping back up the back end of this can put the link in there. And I would say we've been trying to make sure that we also do wreath layings for Eleanor's birthday, Eleanor Roosevelt's birthday, and
Beautiful.
Roosevelt's birthday, and the ADA anniversary. But
Beautiful.
Um,
You mentioned Eleanor. One thing I should mention is in the era of the centennial in the early 80s, the memory of Eleanor Roosevelt had disappeared. People didn't quite remember by the 1980s who Eleanor Roosevelt was. And I believe her name has become so large today, in large part because of the increasing power of women. Women look of last two generations looking for models. And today Eleanor Roosevelt is a household name again, in my opinion. But it's amazing to remember how memories sometimes kind of disappear. And that in the time of her centennial in 1984, it was very hard to get attention paid to her.
all right.
So
Well,
things come and go. There's a kind of
Yeah.
wave aspect to it.
So we've got some time left, and Janine popped up on the screen to signal to me that we've got some questions from the audience. So Janine, if you wouldn't mind sharing a question
Yeah.
for starters, thank you.
All right, this is Janine. We have a question from Virginia. She's asking, was there a live model used for the sculpture of Fala?
I never thought about that. I can't imagine there was, but I've never asked that question. I do. The little anecdote that's interesting, and I may have mentioned it before, was that the idea, as I understand it, came from Senator Carl Levin of Michigan, just recently died. And Carl said, wouldn't it be nice in this kind of innovative memorial to have something that children would respond to? And of course, children, if you go to the sculpture of Fala, you'll see how much the ears have had hands rubbed over it. So the color of the ears, for those who have sight, has really been affected. It was a brilliant idea to have something like that would charm children, and it has. It's just an absolutely brilliant idea. And of course, that had a little bit of pushback. Whoever heard of a dog in a presidential memorial? How outrageous! But that form of outrage has worked, and it's been effective.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that. Janine, you have another good one?
Yeah, we've got three more. So Deborah was intrigued with the chosen word prologue and was curious how that came to be and why was it selected?
I never asked Larry about it, but it seemed to fit. You were putting something at the front of a memorial, and that word from literature would seem to work. I don't remember any controversy about it, but it seemed to fit. I don't remember anybody objecting to it. There had to be some way to figure out how you're gonna put on this large addition to the front of the memorial and choose some wording with it. I don't remember any controversy about it, and it seems to, and obviously is stuck.
Mm-hmm. And let me just add on that for a moment is that, and Peter, maybe you'll recollect have some recollections. The process to come up with that prologue room, it wasn't just Larry Halpern on his own saying it'll be this, that, or the other thing.
Yes.
Can you maybe share some memories about how he did come upon calling it prologue, making it that statue, using the bas relief?
I think it was in Larry's head more than in conversation, trying to figure out, because remember, it's not just messaging for an architect and for sculptures. You need something that is visually interesting, visually significant. This is a visual experience and not a history lesson. It's a visual history. It's a funny thing, a memorial. It's a visual and form of a history lesson, and it's got to work for him or other aesthetic people as an experience as well as something pedagogical. So I think at some point for Larry, he had to envision why you could go through this and not have it become bothersome to the rest of the memorial. It's a sometimes I find the conflict between the pedagogical, the people who want to turn a memorial into something for teaching, as opposed to people who want a memorial to be a beautiful park-like visual experience, is an interesting back and forth. And the architect, in my view, has to appreciate that some people learn visually. Some people don't memorize places and dates. Some people are not moved by rhetoric. Some people are not word oriented, and they are very much, they're just plain visual. And the architect has to do that kind of thing, even if everybody else wants the memorial to be used as a lesson plan, and or as something to as part of their agenda. So I think that was in Larry's head, how he had to do something like that. That's the best I can do.
Oh, I think that's brilliantly stated. And as someone who has taught school, it is a feast day for a teacher to be able to bring students to that memorial because of all of the various access points of learning, from tactile to the visual to the auditory.
We didn't even talk about the tactile and auditory, and that's one of the early comeuppances I had, which is how visual. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial, you're not everyone's reading the Gettysburg Address, and not everyone's reading the second inaugural, but people are so taken with that one enormous sculpture. So it's important with a memorial, in my judgment, to remember this is a visual and sensory and feeling experience, probably more so than a school lesson.
Definitely. Couldn't agree. Well said. Janine, what else you got for us?
Yeah, Jack was asking, who do you think today is drawing the most inspiration from the memorial?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the deepest responses have come from people in the disability community. I have had friends who've had the misfortune of a disability of one kind or another, who have found the Graham disability sculpture to be particularly moving. I think that's been very deep. People who are very sick have seen that sculpture to be inspiring, to keep them going. I think that it has not been used at this moment as a war memorial, but it could be. Anything is possible in our current circumstance with Mr. Putin and Ukraine. People should remember that Franklin Roosevelt, the great warrior, this is our greatest war president, arguably the greatest war president in human history. So maybe that's in the future. I do not see it yet having been used as a memorial to people who've lost their means of income. But it may be. Memorials are funny kind of living things, I've learned. And the way it's honored and used today may not be the way it's honored and used even 6 months from now. I can easily imagine President Biden or future presidents, if we're in a war circumstance, using it as a way to say, look, we've had a great war president. We can do this again. This is our inspiration. Throughout human history, past great figures have been used as a way to inspire the current circumstance. So I could see that happening. But right now, I'd say that for the moment, that disability sculpture is a little more moving for people. The water, by the way, is not a sculpture, but the water is quite another kind of sensory thing. Who ever heard of all this water in a presidential memorial? But I find that the people find the experience, the park-like waterfall experience of going with experiencing the water can sometimes be meaningful. Larry once said to me that with the exception of Florence, Italy, he thought the setting of the FDR Memorial was the most beautiful spot because it had the water of the tidal basin, it had the water in the memorial, it had the great greenery, it had the history. Very few places on the planet have that, and he thought that this and Florence, Italy were rare in that way.
That's pretty good company. I don't think a lot of times you hear people say Washington, DC and Florence. You
Well,
don't.
Roosevelt, I remember being compared to classic figures, Solon lawmakers of the Greek and Italian history, the Renaissance, and the revival of the United States in the mid 20th century are comparable. This is really thinking big. It's not incremental, and I think Larry got it.
Mhm. Well, Peter, I mean, he got it, and because you were part of it, and it was a team, and as you've said, there are so many people who were involved in this, a lot of folks who've come before us, and that memorial wouldn't be there without them.
Yes,
And
I
that
feel
mirror-
like I haven't done a good enough service to people whose names were going to be forgotten or were forgotten. There's another nice touch that I understand Larry did, that the individual workmen who actually put their strength and work women into the memorial apparently all signed the back of the stone that sits in the bookstore. So he wanted to make sure they had their names on this memorial in some form or other. There were so many staffers on Capitol Hill, just people who they did this for their country, just as you would have done to build the memorial at Iwo Jima or military memorials. This was their form of service, and their names will be forgotten no matter how hard you try. But it's a wonderful and beautiful thing that a lot of people over nearly 4 generations did.
Well, I'd say one of the reasons why the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee was established was to make sure that we get that memory and that we record it, and we carry it on. And that's part of the work that we're doing. We have 3 prongs: education, preservation, and inclusion. And so, this is part of that, making sure that we get these stories, that we do remember these individuals, and that we pass these lessons on. I know that I've learned from many folks who've come before me, and I think there's a lot to learn from. There will be new memorials built, and they need to know how to do it. And and
Or they,
you've
have
got
to be
some.
told, or they have to be told they're crazy to get involved.
Well, I think we've gone just 2 minutes over time. But I want to thank Peter for being here, and I'm going to let Janine close it out. But do please, Peter, please accept my great thanks to you for spending the hour with us, but also spending all those other hours on the phone with me talking about the memorial. And I do enjoy them. I like to geek out on certain facts I know about the memorial because nobody else knows them other than you.
Little did I think I'd become the institutional memory, but there you go.
Well, thank you. So Janine, I'm going to leave it to you to close it on out.
Well, thanks, Mary. Thanks, Peter. On behalf of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, I just wanted to thank all of the attendees for participating in this important discussion today. We'd like to thank Cheryl for interpreting and everyone behind the scenes. There's a whole group of people that are addressing technology issues and trying to help everyone have a wonderful experience and learn as much as possible. And of course, Mr. Kovler, thank you for your vision and for being here with us this afternoon.
So I thank you for inviting me to speak.
Thank you. Okay, hope to see you all next week.
Bye-bye.
Are we off?
There's still some attendees.
I'm
Okay.
leaving. I'll leave
All
now.
right. All
Mary,
right.
we'll
Thank you for
reconnect soon.
coming. We'll be
Okay.
in touch.
Best
Bye.
of luck. Bye-bye.